What happens when the life you thought was perfect, the life you thought you could trust, is shattered in an instant? What happens when someone you've known your entire life becomes the person you least expect? Oak Ridge was a town where secrets weren't kept in the open. A town where the rich lived comfortably behind gates and high walls, their secrets tucked away as securely as the fine art hanging on their walls. It was a place where everyone knew everyone, where families lived their lives under the scrutiny of their neighbors, yet somehow nothing ever felt out of place. The McCarthy family had lived in Oak Ridge for decades. Their mansion stood at the top of a hill, overlooking the rest of the town like a fortress. No one ever suspected that a life of luxury could be so fragile. At the center of this world stood Melissa McCarthy, the 27-year-old heiress to the McCarthy oil fortune. Born into wealth, raised in the lap of luxury, Melissa seemed to have it all. Her childhood had been one of privilege, private schools, lavish vacations, and an almost perfect life. Yet, as she grew older, she rejected the public spotlight that her family embraced. She wasn't interested in the glamorous socialite life her parents had envisioned for her. Instead, Melissa worked quietly behind the scenes, using her wealth to fund charitable projects and invest in the future. Despite her efforts to avoid the limelight, Melissa McCarthy was the heiress to one of the wealthiest families in the country. Everyone in Oak Ridge knew who she was, but only a few people truly knew her. She had a select group of friends, none of whom seemed to have the kind of power or wealth Melissa could claim. She liked it that way. Her circle was small, and she preferred it that way. But small circles, too, can hold their own secrets. It was on October 15, 1997, that Melissa vanished. One minute, she was attending a casual dinner with friends at a local restaurant. The next, she was gone. No phone call, no text message, no sign of struggle. Just gone. Her parents, Edward and Lorraine McCarthy, were frantic when they realized she hadn't returned home by 11 p.m. They immediately contacted the local police, but at first, there was nothing to go on. Melissa's car was still parked outside the mansion. Her phone had been left on the kitchen counter, and all of her belongings appeared to be untouched. The house was quiet, eerily quiet. Detective Samantha Pierce was called in to investigate. A seasoned investigator with years of experience handling missing persons cases, Pierce didn't expect this one to be any different. But from the moment she arrived at the McCarthy mansion, she felt something was off. She had dealt with high-profile cases before, but there was something about this one that struck her as different. There was no ransom note, no immediate suspects, no obvious signs of foul play. Just an heiress who had seemingly vanished into thin air. "I've been trying to reach her all night," Edward McCarthy told Pierce, his voice shaking. "Melissa wouldn't just leave without telling someone. She's not the type to disappear. She never does this." Pierce nodded, keeping her face neutral as she took in the scene. The mansion was immaculate. More than just a home, it was a statement. Oak Ridge wasn't just a rich town. It was where the upper echelon lived, and the McCarthys were at the top of that pyramid. But wealth often brings with it its own set of problems. Problems that no amount of money could solve. Pierce was already wondering what kind of problems the McCarthy family might be hiding. "I understand, Mr. McCarthy," Pierce said, her voice steady. "We'll get to the bottom of this. I'll need to ask a few questions about your daughter's whereabouts and her relationships. It's important we know everything." Edward nodded, clearly too shaken to protest. His wife, Lorraine, had been pacing in the background, wringing her hands as she whispered into her phone. The tension was thick in the air, and Pierce knew this wasn't going to be an easy case. The first few hours of the investigation provided no answers. Police combed through the mansion, searching for any clue that could point to Melissa's whereabouts, but everything was eerily normal. No signs of forced entry. No ransom notes. Nothing. Just a missing heiress and an uncomfortably silent home. Pierce's first task was to review the footage from the security cameras around the property. The mansion had a comprehensive security system, and it was one of the first places Pierce looked. But when she saw the footage from the evening of Melissa's disappearance, it didn't add up. The footage showed Melissa leaving the house around 8:45 p.m., dressed in a black dress, heading for her car. The footage from the restaurant confirmed that she arrived there on time, met her friends, and dined with them for the next couple of hours. Everything appeared normal. But what struck Pierce as strange was that the cameras hadn't captured anything after 11 p.m., the time Melissa should have returned home. No footage showed her driving back to the mansion. No footage showed her walking up the driveway. There was simply nothing after 11 p.m. It was as though she had never returned. Pierce spent the following day interviewing Melissa's friends, colleagues, and family. Everyone who knew her seemed to describe her as a kind, charitable, and generous person. No one had any idea who would want to harm her. But one name kept coming up: Robert Hayes. Robert Hayes was a childhood friend of Melissa's, someone she had known since she was young. He had always been a part of her inner circle, and though they had occasionally clashed over business matters, Robert was well liked by her family. But there was something about his recent behavior that seemed off. Robert had been a frequent visitor to the McCarthy mansion over the past few months. But when Pierce went to his office, she was met with an unsettling coldness. Robert had been hesitant when Pierce questioned him, a subtle shift in his demeanor as he spoke. His answers were curt, and there was a noticeable tension in his voice. When asked about Melissa's plans for the evening, he seemed evasive. He mentioned that they had spoken earlier in the day, but refused to elaborate further on their conversation. Did Melissa mention anything about problems with the family? Pierce asked. Any financial issues or threats? Robert's eyes darted nervously. No, he replied quickly. She was just busy with some business deals. Nothing major. I'm sure she's fine. Pierce studied Robert carefully, trying to discern whether he was hiding something. But it wasn't just his nervousness that caught her attention. It was his repeated refusal to talk about their personal relationship. Why had he been so evasive? Had he been hiding something? As the days passed, the investigation took several twists. Information came in that pointed to a variety of potential leads: financial difficulties in the McCarthy family, secret business dealings, and even possible threats. But the breakthrough came when the family's lawyer, Daniel Kemp, contacted the police. Daniel had worked for the McCarthys for years, and his relationship with them had always been professional, until now. I think Melissa found something, Daniel told Pierce, his voice tense over the phone. Something big. I think she was going to expose it. Expose what? Pierce asked, intrigued. I can't say much, but I'm worried. She was planning to go public with some information, and I think someone might have caught wind of it. I think someone tried to stop her from revealing it. The final clue, a voicemail left by Melissa herself, was what Pierce needed to confirm her suspicions. The message, left just hours before her disappearance, was a warning. In the voicemail, Melissa sounded scared, her voice shaky. I think they know, and I don't know what to do anymore, Melissa said. I'm going to tell Dad everything. I think I'm in danger. What if the truth is buried beneath layers of lies so thick, even the people closest to you can't see it? And what if the answers you've been looking for were hidden right in front of your eyes the entire time? Detective Samantha Pierce stood at the edge of the McCarthy estate, watching the house in front of her. The mansion was silent, as if it had never been disturbed. In the weeks that followed Melissa's disappearance, Oak Ridge had grown increasingly uneasy. The rich, beautiful town that had once been a safe haven for secrets was now filled with whispers. And at the center of it all was the McCarthy family, their perfect image shattered by the disappearance of their daughter, the heiress to their fortune. Pierce had been investigating this case for days, but it felt as though she was walking in circles. Each lead seemed to vanish as quickly as it appeared. And every time she thought she had a breakthrough, something new would come up that muddied the waters. But there was one thing Pierce couldn't shake: the voicemail from Melissa. The last message she had left, full of fear, full of foreboding. "I think they know, and I don't know what to do anymore. I'm going to tell Dad everything. I think I'm in danger." That message had stuck with Pierce like a splinter in her mind. Melissa had been scared, terrified even, but why? What had she been about to reveal? And why hadn't she ever shared this with anyone else? The first place Pierce turned to next was the McCarthy family lawyer, Daniel Kemp. The voicemail had prompted him to come forward with more information, and Pierce hoped that he could help untangle the web of secrets that had been keeping Melissa's disappearance locked away. When Pierce arrived at Daniel Kemp's office, she was greeted by a tall, thin man in his late 40s, wearing a perfectly pressed suit. His office, like the rest of Oak Ridge, was immaculately clean and polished. Every corner of the room seemed to reflect the wealth and power that had come with his position. Kemp motioned for Pierce to sit, but she could sense the tension in his movements. "I didn't want to get involved, Detective," Daniel said, his voice steady but heavy with regret. "But after hearing that voicemail, I don't think I can stay silent anymore. I think Melissa knew something about her family's business that we were all supposed to ignore." "What kind of thing?" Pierce asked, her voice calm but insistent. She could feel the urgency behind Daniel's words. "I don't know all the details," Daniel said, rubbing his hands together nervously. "But for the last year, Melissa had been digging into her father's company. McCarthy Oil had always been a legitimate business, but recently, well, let's just say there were things going on behind the scenes. There were rumors of offshore accounts, shell companies, and deals with foreign governments. Melissa was determined to find out the truth, and from what I gather, she was getting close." Pierce leaned in, her interest piqued. "Do you think she uncovered something that put her in danger?" Daniel hesitated for a moment, his eyes darting to the door. "It's possible. The McCarthy family has always had enemies, and some of them aren't the kind of people you want to cross. If Melissa had been getting too close to the truth, it's not hard to imagine why someone would want to silence her." Pierce took note of Daniel's unease. "So, you're telling me that Melissa was trying to expose something? Something big?" "Yes," Daniel said, his voice barely above a whisper. "And I think she found it. I think she found something that could destroy everything her father worked for." As Pierce left Daniel Kemp's office, she felt the weight of the case grow heavier on her shoulders. Melissa McCarthy hadn't just disappeared, she had been silenced. Someone had wanted to keep her from exposing the truth about the McCarthy family's business. But who? And why did it have to be Melissa? Pierce needed answers, and she needed them fast. The more she thought about it, the more she realized that this wasn't just about the disappearance of an heiress, it was about a web of corruption, secrets, and lies. A web that Melissa had been trying to pull apart. The next few days were filled with interviews and dead ends. The McCarthy family had been less than cooperative, their grief clouded by a deep-rooted desire to protect their family's name. Edward McCarthy, Melissa's father, was a cold man, always appearing collected and composed, but his eyes gave him away. There was something off about him. His answers were too calculated, his demeanor too controlled. Pierce had asked him about the last time he saw his daughter, and his story seemed rehearsed. "She was leaving for a trip," Edward had said when Pierce asked him to recount the evening. "She called me before she left, said she was going to clear her head. I don't know what happened after that. She's been under a lot of stress lately." But Pierce didn't buy it. Every instinct told her that Edward McCarthy knew more than he was letting on. His aloofness, the lack of concern in his voice, it all seemed too calculated. Too perfect. On the evening of October 15th, the day after Melissa vanished, Pierce went back to the McCarthy mansion, hoping to find something new, something that would reveal the truth. The house was eerily quiet, but there was one place she hadn't checked thoroughly, the family's private study. Inside, the room was like a museum. Expensive furniture, antique paintings, and shelves filled with leather-bound books. The room was dimly lit, casting shadows on the polished floors. But it was a desk drawer that caught Pierce's attention. It was slightly ajar, and inside, she found a series of folders labeled with strange codes and addresses. They weren't marked with any names, but the codes were familiar. Addresses to offshore accounts, corporations in tax havens, and transactions involving foreign governments. These were the kinds of things that could ruin a family's reputation if they ever saw the light of day. There was one folder that seemed to contain the most information. It was thicker than the others, with papers spilling out of it. As Pierce flipped through the documents, she found more encrypted files, accounts linked to McCarthy Oil, and communications with a mysterious entity known only as Davidson. The name rang a bell. Pierce had seen it in the financial records. But there was more. The last page in the folder had a note scrawled in Melissa's handwriting. "I have to stop this before it's too late. They'll do anything to protect it. If something happens to me, look for Davidson. They know everything." Pierce's stomach dropped. Melissa had been more than just a victim in this case. She had been a whistleblower. And she had been trying to stop something much bigger than herself. Sometimes the darkest secrets are buried under the weight of the people who don't want to remember them. But what happens when the past comes crashing into the present, threatening everything that's been carefully hidden? What happens when the people you trust the most can't be trusted at all? Detective Samantha Pierce stood in front of the McCarthy mansion, the weight of the documents in her hands heavy with the realization that the case had shifted. What started as a missing persons investigation had become something far more complicated and far more dangerous. As she walked back through the grand entrance of the mansion, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. It was as if the walls themselves were trying to conceal something from her, something that had been buried for far too long. The discovery of the encrypted files in the study, the ones with Melissa's handwritten note, had confirmed her growing suspicions. Melissa McCarthy hadn't just vanished. She had been silenced because she had uncovered something massive, something that could bring down the McCarthy family empire. The family's carefully crafted image of wealth and respectability was now crumbling, one piece at a time. But what exactly had Melissa uncovered? And why had she been willing to risk everything to expose it? As Pierce reviewed the file she had found in the study, she noticed a recurring name, Davidson. Whoever this person was, they had a level of influence that seemed to extend well beyond the McCarthy family. The more Pierce dug into the name, the more elusive Davidson became. No one had ever heard of them, and there was no trace of their identity in the McCarthy family's public records. But what was clear was that Davidson had a direct connection to the offshore accounts, the money laundering, and the dark secrets that the McCarthy family had been hiding for years. Pierce felt like she was chasing shadows, but she knew that Davidson was the key to everything. Whoever they were, they had the power to destroy everything the McCarthy family had built, and they would stop at nothing to protect their secrets. The investigation took a sudden turn when Pierce received an anonymous tip. The caller was breathless, panicked, and refused to reveal their identity. But what they said made Pierce's blood run cold. "I know where she is. I know what happened to Melissa. But if you go looking, they'll come for you too," the caller said before hanging up abruptly. Pierce stared at the phone in her hand, heart racing. Could this be the break she'd been waiting for? Or was it just another dead end? She couldn't ignore the urgency in the caller's voice. They knew something, and they were terrified. Later that evening, Pierce met with Officer Samira Brooks, her trusted colleague who had been helping her with the investigation. Samira had been following up on the lead regarding the Davidson name, and she had found something worth noting, an obscure connection between Davidson and several high-profile figures in the city. The more Samira had dug, the more she realized that Davidson wasn't just someone with money and power. They were deeply embedded in the political structure of the region, working behind the scenes to keep everything in place. "Detective, I think we need to look into local politics," Samira said, her voice low as she passed Pierce a folder. "Davidson isn't just a businessman. They're involved in some very shady deals with people in power." Pierce opened the folder, scanning the documents Samira had compiled. The connection between Davidson and several influential local politicians was clear, but what stood out to her was the mention of a political campaign, a campaign that had been funded by McCarthy Oil and had included significant donations from anonymous sources. It was all coming together. Melissa had been getting close to something massive, an illegal political operation funded by the McCarthy family. But why had Melissa been the one to uncover it? And why had they chosen to silence her? "I think it's time we take a closer look at Melissa's business dealings," Pierce said, her voice steady but filled with determination. "We've been looking at her disappearance from the wrong angle. It's not just about the family, it's about the people they were trying to protect themselves from." The next morning, Pierce returned to the McCarthy mansion, determined to get answers. She had a plan. She needed to speak with the family's employees. They might have seen something, overheard something that could shed light on the events leading up to Melissa's disappearance. The more Pierce thought about it, the more she realized that the people closest to Melissa might be the ones hiding the most. She needed to speak with the household staff. Pierce began with the housekeeper, a woman named Elena who had worked for the McCarthy family for over a decade. Elena was soft-spoken but had a reputation for being observant. She had seen it all, the comings and goings of the family, the subtle tension that had started to build in the months before Melissa's disappearance. "I don't know much, Detective," Elena said, wringing her hands nervously as she sat across from Pierce in the McCarthy kitchen. "But I did see something strange the week before Melissa went missing." Pierce leaned forward, her eyes focused. "What did you see?" "I saw Robert Hayes," Elena said, her voice barely above a whisper. "He came to the house late one night, later than usual. It was just before Melissa disappeared, and he was upset. He and Mr. McCarthy were arguing in the study. It wasn't the first time, but this time it was different. I heard Robert say something like, 'If she finds out, it's all over.'" Pierce's stomach tightened. The connection between Robert and Melissa was already suspicious, but this was a clue she couldn't ignore. Robert had been involved in some way, but what had he meant by that? What had Melissa found out? Elena continued, "I overheard Robert say he didn't want to lose everything. I couldn't hear much else, but I know they were talking about something big." As Pierce left the mansion that evening, the weight of the investigation grew heavier. The pieces were starting to fit together, but there were still too many unanswered questions. Who was Davidson? How did they tie into the McCarthy family's operations? And what had Melissa been on the verge of exposing? The phone call from the anonymous tipster lingered in Pierce's mind. Someone knew the truth. Someone who had been close to the McCarthy family. Someone who had seen it all. But who? And why had they waited so long to come forward? The next day, Pierce got a breakthrough. One of the financial analysts who had worked for McCarthy Oil came forward with more information. The analyst had seen the same pattern in the family's business dealings, the use of offshore accounts, hidden assets, and shell companies used to fund political campaigns. But what stood out the most was the analyst's statement about a meeting he had overheard between Edward McCarthy and Robert Hayes. The meeting had taken place in the family's private study, just days before Melissa's disappearance. And the analyst had heard one phrase clearly: "If Melissa finds out, we'll all go down." What do you do when the people you trust the most turn out to be the ones who can betray you the easiest? What happens when the truth is hidden so deep, it feels like it will never come to light? Detective Samantha Pierce felt the weight of the case bearing down on her as she entered the dimly lit conference room. The McCarthy mansion was still fresh in her mind, the secrecy in every corner, the polished perfection of the life the family had built. Yet, beneath it all, something dark was lurking, something that could bring everything crashing down. The investigation had taken a dark turn, and the more Pierce uncovered, the more she felt like she was being led into a carefully constructed maze. Every turn seemed to reveal a new clue, a new piece of the puzzle, but each piece brought her closer to a terrifying truth. Melissa McCarthy had been silenced because she was about to expose the McCarthy family's darkest secrets. The connection to Davidson was undeniable now. Whoever they were at the heart of the family's criminal empire. They were the one person no one had been able to track down, but everything Pierce had uncovered suggested that Davidson had been working behind the scenes to cover up the illegal financial dealings that had been going on for years. Offshore accounts, shell companies, shady political donations. The McCarthy family's wealth had been built on a web of deceit, and Melissa had stumbled upon it. The more Pierce thought about the case, the more the pieces started to connect. The final clue from the household staff, Elena's testimony about Robert Hayes' involvement, and the phone call from the anonymous tipster all pointed to one thing: Davidson was the key. If Pierce could track down this shadowy figure, everything would fall into place. But first, there was one last question to answer. Who was Davidson? The investigation had hit a dead end when it came to identifying Davidson. No one knew who they were, and every lead Pierce followed seemed to lead to more questions. But just as the case was starting to feel like it might stall, Pierce received another tip: a name, a place, and a connection. The tip came through a secure line. A voice, low and distorted, spoke with an urgency that sent a shiver down Pierce's spine. "You're close. The answer you're looking for is in Miami. Go to the Palisade building. They know what happened to Melissa. Davidson's waiting for you there." The voice quickly hung up before Pierce could ask more questions. Miami? The Palisade building? Pierce had no idea what the caller meant, but the message was clear. Davidson was connected to Miami. And whoever this person was, they were involved in Melissa's disappearance. It was the lead Pierce had been waiting for. She gathered her team and made preparations to leave for Miami. The stakes had never been higher, and Pierce knew that time was running out. Every moment spent chasing down false leads meant Melissa's disappearance remained unsolved. But she could feel the weight of the case. The deeper she dug, the more she realized how dangerous it had become. Whoever Davidson was, they had powerful allies, and they weren't going to let anyone get too close. The flight to Miami was tense. Pierce's mind raced with thoughts of what she might find once she reached the Palisade building. The name meant nothing to her, but she had a gut feeling that it held the answers to everything. The city sprawled out beneath her as the plane descended, and Pierce's anticipation grew with each passing minute. When she arrived in Miami, Pierce was greeted by the humid air, the bustling streets, and the gleaming glass buildings that surrounded the Palisade building. She could sense the tension mounting as she walked toward the towering structure, the sound of her footsteps echoing in the vast lobby. The building itself was pristine, a gleaming symbol of wealth and power, but what Pierce was looking for wasn't on the outside. It was hidden inside, behind closed doors, in the shadows where Davidson was waiting. The elevator ride was long, and Pierce's thoughts were filled with the unknown. She had a vague sense of where to go: an office, a floor, and a person. But when the elevator doors opened, Pierce was met with a wall of silence. The hallway was empty, but she knew someone was watching. She could feel the eyes on her, like she had walked straight into the heart of the storm. She made her way to the office suite, where a woman sat behind a sleek desk, her back to Pierce as she typed away at the computer. The woman didn't turn when Pierce entered. Her silence spoke volumes. "I'm looking for Davidson," Pierce said, her voice calm but assertive. The woman at the desk didn't flinch. "Davidson isn't here," the woman replied, her voice neutral. "You're in the wrong place." Pierce stepped closer, her eyes scanning the room for any sign of a hidden trap. "I don't think I am. I'm here about Melissa McCarthy." At the mention of Melissa's name, the woman's expression shifted, barely noticeable, but enough for Pierce to catch it. It was a flicker of recognition, a brief hesitation. The woman slowly turned to face Pierce, her cold gaze locking onto hers. "You're making a mistake," the woman said, her voice low. "You have no idea what you're getting into." Pierce didn't back down. She had come this far, and she wasn't going to stop now. "Tell me who Davidson is. I know they're connected to the McCarthy family, and I know they're the key to everything that's happened to Melissa." The woman's eyes darkened as she leaned back in her chair. For a moment, Pierce thought she might get nothing more than resistance. But then, the woman spoke, her voice barely a whisper. "Davidson is no one's friend. But you've been chasing ghosts." Melissa wasn't just caught up in some petty family drama. She was the target of something much larger. The McCarthys were never meant to get involved with Davidson. But once they did, there was no turning back. Pierce's heart raced as the words sank in. This wasn't just about a family fortune, it was about something far bigger, something that spanned years of hidden deals, underground networks, and powerful connections. Melissa had been caught in the crossfire of a battle that had been brewing long before she ever knew what was going on. "Where is Davidson?" Pierce pressed. "What happened to Melissa?" But the woman's face hardened, and she stood up from her desk, moving toward the back of the office. "You need to leave now. You've made a mistake coming here. Trust me, it's better if you don't know." Pierce took one step closer. "I'm not leaving until I have answers." The woman paused, and for a moment, Pierce thought she might get the truth. But then, a door opened behind the woman, and two men stepped out from the shadows. They were tall, broad-shouldered, and dressed in dark suits, their eyes cold as they locked onto Pierce. "You need to go," one of them said, his voice firm. Pierce's instincts flared, and she took a step back. She wasn't going to get anything more from them now. But she had one thing left to do: leave with the knowledge that Davidson was closer than ever. Whoever they weren't going to let Pierce get any closer. What if everything you thought you knew about someone turned out to be a lie? What happens when the person you trust most is the one who orchestrated your downfall from the very beginning? Detective Samantha Pierce stood in the elevator of the Palisade building, the hum of the machinery in the background as the doors slowly closed. Her mind raced with what she had just learned. The woman in the office had been right about one thing: Pierce had made a mistake. The McCarthy family's ties to Davidson were deeper than she had realized. But what had really unsettled her was the subtle threat she had felt when she was asked to leave. It wasn't a warning, it was a command. Whoever was behind Davidson didn't want Pierce asking questions anymore. They didn't want her anywhere near the truth. As the elevator reached the ground floor, Pierce's thoughts were interrupted by her phone ringing. She glanced at the screen. It was Officer Samira Brooks. "Detective, you need to hear this," Samira said, her voice filled with urgency. "We've got something big." "What is it?" Pierce asked, her heart rate quickening. "It's about Robert Hayes," Samira replied. "We've been running his background, and I think we finally found something that connects him directly to the McCarthys and Davidson." Pierce's stomach dropped. Robert Hayes was the person who had been acting strangely throughout the investigation. He had been evasive when questioned, and his connections to Melissa were too close for comfort. But now, it seemed like the trail was leading back to him, and it was only a matter of time before they uncovered his role in Melissa's disappearance. "Tell me what you've got," Pierce said, already reaching for her car keys. "His financials, Detective," Samira continued. There were multiple transactions from his personal accounts to a series of offshore companies tied directly to Davidson. We've confirmed he was working with them in a joint operation, one that's been going on for years. And it's not just about money laundering. It's about political influence, dirty deals, and possibly even more illegal activities. Pierce's pulse quickened. This was the breakthrough she had been waiting for, but it was only the beginning. If Robert Hayes was involved with Davidson, then it meant the McCarthys were more deeply enmeshed in criminal activity than she had thought. The family's wealth, power, and influence were all tied to the very people who had silenced Melissa McCarthy. Pierce didn't waste time. She needed to confront Robert Hayes, and she needed to do it quickly. The fact that he had been avoiding her questions now seemed like more than just a coincidence. He knew more than he was letting on, and Pierce could feel the walls closing in. She arrived at Robert's apartment late in the evening. The building was upscale, located in one of Miami's most affluent neighborhoods. As Pierce approached the door, she felt a strange sense of déjà vu. She had been here before, speaking to Robert during the early stages of the investigation. At the time, she had no idea just how deeply involved he was with the McCarthys and Davidson. When Robert answered the door, he was still dressed in a suit, as if he hadn't changed since his last meeting with the McCarthys. His face, once confident, now seemed weary, almost defeated. "Detective Pierce," he greeted her coldly, but there was a hint of nervousness in his eyes. "What brings you here tonight?" "I think it's time we talk about your involvement with the McCarthy family and Davidson," Pierce said, her voice steady, her eyes locking with his. Robert stiffened at the mention of Davidson's name. He had clearly been expecting this, but it didn't stop the shock from registering on his face. "I don't know what you mean," Robert replied quickly, trying to mask his unease with an air of indifference. "I'm just a businessman. I don't have anything to do with any—" "Cut the act, Robert," Pierce interrupted. "I've seen the transactions. You've been working with Davidson for years. You're tied to them in more ways than I can count. And you know exactly what happened to Melissa McCarthy." Robert's eyes flickered with panic for just a moment, but he quickly regained his composure. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said, his voice low and controlled. "I had nothing to do with Melissa's disappearance." Pierce took a step forward, her tone hardening. "Then explain why your name keeps popping up in connection with offshore accounts, illegal deals, and financial transactions tied to Davidson." Robert's face drained of color. His posture stiffened, and for a moment, Pierce thought he might collapse under the weight of his own guilt. But then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he spoke. "I didn't want this." "None of us did," he said, his words rushed. "Melissa was getting too close to the truth. She was going to ruin everything. She found out about the deals, the illegal campaign funds, the money laundering. She was going to go public with it. I tried to stop her, but she wouldn't listen. She was determined to expose everything." Pierce's heart pounded in her chest as Robert's words hung in the air. This was it. The moment she had been waiting for. "So you're saying that Melissa was killed because she knew too much?" Pierce asked, her voice shaking with the weight of the revelation. Robert didn't answer immediately. Instead, he turned away, pacing for a moment, trying to gather his thoughts. Then, with a deep sigh, he spoke again. "I didn't want her to disappear," he said, his voice thick with regret. "I just wanted her to stop. To go away and forget everything. But someone else was involved. Someone who wasn't going to let her walk away." Pierce's mind raced as she processed Robert's words. Who else? Who's behind this? Robert turned back to face her, his eyes filled with fear. Davidson. They're the ones who really control everything. They didn't want anyone getting too close to the truth. And Melissa was the biggest threat. Pierce didn't waste another moment. She needed to get to Davidson, and she needed to do it now. Robert's confession had been the missing piece of the puzzle. Melissa hadn't just disappeared. She had been taken because she knew too much, because she had uncovered a conspiracy that had reached the highest levels of power. And whoever Davidson was, they were the ones pulling the strings. The next day, Pierce was back at the McCarthy mansion, but this time, she wasn't looking for clues. She was looking for answers. She had spent the last few days chasing shadows, tracking down leads, following the money, and trying to understand the larger conspiracy at play. Now, it was time to confront the family directly. Pierce arrived to find Edward McCarthy standing at the front door, his face drawn with worry. The moment he saw her, his expression shifted to one of calculated indifference. But Pierce could see the anxiety behind his eyes. "You've been digging into things you shouldn't, Detective," Edward said, his voice cold. "There's nothing more for you here." Pierce didn't back down. "I know about Davidson, Mr. McCarthy. I know what you've been hiding. And I know that your daughter Melissa discovered everything before she vanished." Edward's eyes flickered for a moment, a brief flash of panic crossing his face. But just as quickly, he regained his composure. "You don't know what you're dealing with. Davidson is beyond you. This has nothing to do with Melissa. Nothing to do with the family." "You're lying," Pierce said, her voice cutting through the tension. "Your family has been at the center of it all. And now, because of you, Melissa is gone."